So we're going to do something a little bit different here today. And one thing that I've noticed is that as you have all these articles coming out about what's happening in El Salvador, there's a lot of journalism being done by people who've never even visited El Salvador, who don't understand the history, and they get a lot of things really, really wrong. We've seen that even with the Bitcoin, with stuff to do with Bitcoin Beach, of them saying, sometimes on the positive side, like, oh, everyone uses Bitcoin, you can't use dollars anywhere, which is definitely not true. But then on the other side, like, oh, nobody uses Bitcoin anywhere, people hate it. And so you have these reporters coming in with an agenda, and that's just for the Bitcoin Beach stuff. But for El Salvador in general, especially as Nayib Bukele's public persona becomes, very much on the main stage, you have reporters writing articles that really miss a lot of the significant facts. And I was reading one today by National Review, which in general I really enjoy and put a lot of value on the journalism done by National Review. I listen to the editor's podcast that they put out every week, and it's been a magazine that I've read since university. Maybe my views aligned a little bit more when I was younger. I'm not the American nationalist that I was when I was, in my 20s. But I still think that National Review does really good journalism and has good takes. But today I read an article called Nayib Bukele is no conservative hero. And I was really embarrassed for the magazine because they got so many of the basic facts wrong. I mean, it wasn't even that they had a different opinion. It was that they were just way off base. And it's kind of surprising this coming, I expect it from CNN or, MSNBC, but to see a publication like National Review miss this so badly, I thought it might be a cool thing for us to do, to in between our normal podcast, to just take articles written on El Salvador and kind of dissect them for the audience and go through and read what they say and then give a take on, whether or not we think that was a valid commentary. So
this tagline, I got to say right off the bat, doesn't make any sense for what's really happening in this country at all.
Well, I think it's that people are saying, because in the U.S., people like Tucker Carlson are, basically saying, hey, we need somebody like Nayib Bukele in the U.S. that's going to come back and clean up, all these cities that are disintegrating, and somebody that's tough on crime. And so I think that's kind of what they're hitting at right there, that conservatives shouldn't be putting Nayib up on a pedestal. I don't know, Andy, do you want to start us off and kind of read through this, and then I'll give some commentary on it?
The American right should not praise El Salvador's leader, a tyrant in the making with possible criminal ties.
So it's just right there in the title. I mean, that's very sensationalism, a tyrant in the making. I mean, they don't provide like any backing on why they're making those assumptions. It's, very inflammatory. And with possible criminal ties, they go into that later, and anybody else, if you were writing about somebody in the U.S., they would come after you for slander, for having those kind of jump to conclusions. So we'll get into the specifics, but I just expect a lot more from National Review than to come up with this kind of sensational headlines.
Right. Nayib Bukele, El Salvador's millennium president, is quickly becoming the darling of some American conservatives. First, it was his embrace of Bitcoin as currency in his country. Now, it's for his tough stance on gang crime. American conservatives began showering praise on Bukele after he posted a series of videos showing imprisoned gang members being transferred to a maximum security prison. But Bukele isn't a conservative. He's a tyrant in the making. Really?
So it's... It is true. There are a lot of conservative news commentators that probably couldn't have picked out El Salvador on a map a couple years ago that have been picking up on the prison videos that Bukele has released recently, showing them doing the first transfer of 2,000 gang members to the prison. And I think a lot of them, they don't understand even the context or the reason to have those type of videos kind of gone back and forth with Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation, because Alex was saying, hey, this is prison porn. This is what tyrants do to intimidate their opponents. And, I explained to Alex that no, the gangs have really held Salvadorans captive for decades now. And so most people are very skeptical that there's going to be any real change, that they don't have to worry about the gangs, that they can go out and be free at night, that they can go back into the downtown of San Salvador. And so the reason for, releasing this video, which was, I'll agree with them, it's a little over the top, it's set to dramatic music, but it's really showing to the general populace that, hey, the government's in control again, the gang leaders have been locked up, and you can feel freedom again. You can go out and explore the country. You don't have to live in fear anymore. And so I think people are maybe not knowing the context of what has happened historically in El Salvador and understanding that the gangs kind of controlled everything historically. Maybe they don't understand the reason for this. But, that's the job of the journalists. They should dive into that background a little bit more.
Yeah, you would think that the people here would understand that a lot more, and that the journalists would do the job and get the viewpoint of the people and understand how what an important thing that is.
Yeah. So then he goes, those praising him now will soon wish they hadn't support him or wish that they would forget. So, they're and I think, you look historically, there have been times that people have held up certain charismatic leaders as the savior or somebody that, is going to do miraculous things, and they've regretted it. I mean, you've seen that with Mugabe, or even some people holding up Chavez in his early days. So I think that's what they're trying to insinuate, that it's going to be a similar thing with Nayib. But Andy, if you can keep reading in there, we'll get a little bit more into the details.
In 2019, Nayib Bukele made history as the first third-party candidate to win a presidential election in El Salvador since 1992. The 1992 end of the civil war between communist and right-wing militias. Free market enthusiasts became the first cheerleaders as he jumped on the cryptocurrency bandwagon and exempted what word am I looking at?
Exempting crypto gains from taxation.
Oh yeah, you don't have to pay your crypto gains. He not only made Bitcoin legal tender currency in the country, he also forced businesses to take payments in Bitcoin. In addition, he invested a significant share of the country's wealth in Bitcoin, a move that almost bankrupted the country as cryptocurrency prices tumbled. Now, that's not entirely true.
Well, it's not entirely true. I mean, it's really comical. I mean, focus on that last part. In addition, he invested a significant share of the country's wealth in Bitcoin. I think there's been $110 million of Bitcoin purchases out of a $30 billion, yearly economy. So it's not saying that it's not significant at all, but I mean, this is like a road project. This is not anything. This is really a rounding error as far as the country's revenue or even tax receipts go. So to say that he invested a significant, share of the country's wealth in Bitcoin, it's just silly. Like, why would you be so lazy and over the top? Let's really dive into the numbers. If you have problems with what he did, let's at least be realistic about it. And then he follows it up with a move that almost bankrupted the country as cryptocurrency prices tumbled. It had no negative impact on the country. I mean, they haven't sold the Bitcoin, so they haven't even realized the loss, but it didn't. How are they saying that it almost bankrupted the country? The country is really become an economic miracle. I mean, the growth keeps exceeding expectations. Tourism's up off the charts. There's all kinds of new businesses and investment coming into the country. Anybody who's looking for a job now, especially in this area, I mean, that's the complaint I hear from business owners, is they can't find enough employees. So it's just comical that they would jump to this and say, it almost bankrupted the country.
You have to think to yourself, is this a lazy journalism? Is this a mistake, or is this purposefully misleading the readership into thinking something? It's biased, right?
It
has to be. I can't think of that's.
It really is perplexing. I would love to talk to this journalist and ask him, like, what are you thinking when it comes to this? In fact, when people talk about, oh, El Salvador spent all this money on Bitcoin, wasted this money, they actually, because people overreacted when they adopted Bitcoin and their bond prices tumbled, El Salvador took advantage of that and bought back close to, I think it was like $1 billion or $2 billion worth of bonds that they bought back. And they actually saved $300 million in buying those bonds back early. So they actually had the bond holders pay for everything they've done with the Bitcoin endeavors, the amount of Bitcoin they bought, the amount of Bitcoin that they gave to the population, all the expenses involved, they've actually saved on that one thing. So, and, I'm not saying you can directly say they claim credit for that, and probably wasn't intended consequences, but it did happen. They saved that money. And I don't know. It's just kind of comical when they say that
story's not written here.
It just doesn't make any sense. And this is coming from National Review. It makes me really sad that that's like the depth that they've fallen to, that I would think they would at least have editors that would question, like, how are you making, those statements that it almost bankrupted the country? Like, I'm just curious as to how they would even justify that. But let's go on.
Even as Bukele garnered libertarian fans around the world with his pro-cryptocurrency policies, he began centralizing power around himself. In 2021, without much international outcry, his party's legislators removed and replaced 1/3 of the Supreme Court's constitutional chamber, whose jurisdiction is interpreting constitutional matters.
Well, so it definitely did cause lots of waves. It didn't go out unnoticed, and it did create quite a bit of international outcry with people saying that he illegally removed the Supreme Court justices, most of them without them understanding how the constitutional court works in El Salvador, that it's not like the US, the Supreme Court justices do not have placement for life. And the person in power does have the ability to change who the justices are. Nayib took advantage of a part of the law that allowed him to recall the judges early before he would have normally been able to put his own folks in. And he was able to do that because I think he needed, it was either 2/3 or 3/4 of the assembly to vote in favor, basically, of impeaching these justices, and they had accused them of fraud. And that was, now maybe it was not something that was normally done, them using that process, but it was something he legally had the power to do, and he had the support of the assembly to get to that vote. And I think really that is where most people find fault with Nayib, is they don't like how popular he is. And they don't like how high a percentage of the assembly that his people control. But I mean, that's not his fault. Like, the opposition should do a better job of putting forth good candidates to provide those checks. If you had in the US or Europe or anywhere else, any world leader that had 90% approval ratings, they would be pulling all the levers available to them to replace the existing people with their own people.
Absolutely.
That's how the system's set up for, and that's what politicians do. So it just is silly for them to criticize him for doing the same thing. I mean, Biden talked about packing the Supreme Court in the US, and he didn't even have 50% of the people's support. If Biden had 90%,
38%.
If Biden had 90% support, there would be 100 Supreme Court justices now in the U.S.
Correct.
And, the majority of them appointed by him. And so I'm not wild about people, taking these extraordinary moves, but what he did was very normal for anybody who had the level of support. And people wanted him to clean house. They wanted him to sweep these people out. They had presided over these years of El Salvador only working for the wealthy, and there being a lot of endemic corruption. And so people were behind this move. But if you just read this article, it sounds like he's, doing all these things that the people don't support and things that are totally unconstitutional. But that's just not the case.
Shortly thereafter, Bukele said he would run for re-election, even though El Salvador's constitution clearly states that presidential candidates cannot be anyone who has occupied the office of the president of the republic for over 6 months, conservative or not, during the immediate preceding period or the preceding 6 months before the new presidential term.
So this is true. Bukele has, according to him, found a reinterpretation of a law that shows that he can run for another term. Historically, El Salvador has only been a one-term, allowed for one presidential term. Now, of course, this is not an unusual thing for politicians to do. We saw this in the U.S. with Mayor Bloomberg, who he was only supposed to be able to have 2, terms as mayor in New York, but he found a need for him to run for a third term and somehow, change the rules or change the law so that he could run for a third term. We see this all over the world. It happens. I'm not in favor of a sitting president changing the rules in ways that favor them, but I also think it's silly to have 5-year term limit on a president because that really encourages short-term thinking, and you can't bring real change or real projects in 5 years. And so that just encourages presidents to come in, take as much money, loot as much of the treasury as they can, give as much graft to their friends, and then get out. And I think in the US, we allow for 2 terms. Most, first world countries in the world allow for either at least 2 terms, if not indefinite terms. I think in Canada, can't they run forever? Isn't that, hasn't Trudeau been in office for?
It feels like it.
Yeah. So for us to say hey, no, you should only be allowed to have 1 term, even though we're going to allow our presidents or our leaders to have multiple terms.
It's a little disingenuous.
Yeah, it's very condescending. Now, I agree. People should be called up. People should be questioning these things. But I actually think it's a good change for them to allow presidents in El Salvador to have at least 2 terms, because you really do want longer term planning. And the people in El Salvador would basically riot if Bukele wasn't running for a second term. I think they would surround his house and force him to run again. That's how popular he is right now. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that's the reality. Bukele really is responding to what the people want him to do. And if you were to just read this article, you don't get that. They really make it sound like this is some type of banana republic that he's, thwarting the will of the people instead of going along with the will of the people.
The people would want that to happen, exactly.
Yeah.
Says, but Bukele's handpicked Supreme Court justices ignored the plain meaning of the words to allow their preferred candidate to stay in power, perhaps without any limit.
So I agree with their take on that. They are. It's no more absurd than Biden's using this loophole to say that he can forgive, $400 billion in student debt, which any legal person will say is totally illegal. But Biden's still doing it, and the people are praising him for doing it. So that's a normal thing that politicians do. It's not the ideal way that this would have happened, but the end result of allowing 2 terms for presidents in El Salvador, I actually think is a healthy change here.
If Bukele's Bitcoin enthusiasm won him support from libertarians, his efforts to bring down the high rates of crime and murder in El Salvador have endeared him to conservatives. In 2020, Bukele sought increased funding for his territorial control plan, an aggressive campaign to decrease the country's sky-high homicide rate by confronting violent gangs. When the assembly took longer than he expected to approve funding for his plan, the cool president deployed the military to the legislative chambers and demanded the legislators support his plan, threatening to call an insurrection to dissolve it if they did not. The assembly balked. however, and the Supreme Court, before Bukele packed it with his cronies, ordered him not to use the military in such a manner.
So I actually lived here during this time. It was not nearly as dramatic as this makes it sound. They were trying to get more equipment, bulletproof vests and other things for the police and the military too, which were often outgunned by the gang members. And so Bukele was frustrated because the existing people in government were really trying to thwart him at every turn, not because they disagreed with what he was doing, just they didn't want him to have wins. And so he did on this occasion bring the military into the assembly. They weren't pointing guns at anybody. It was probably a mistake. It was especially considering some of the history in El Salvador and the rest of Latin America. It probably was not prudent of him to do, but he was a young leader and he was frustrated with this lack. But there was never any intimidation or threatening that they were going to shoot people or dissolve anybody. He was basically like, hey, if you don't want to approve the gear for these people, say it to their face. They're right here in front of you. And yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to bring it up and to ask whether it was the best thing, but it was definitely way less dramatic than this makes it sound like.
After the Bitcoin charade and the military takeover of Congress came the emergency powers. They're really like lining things up.
So the Bitcoin charade, I mean, they haven't extrapolated on why they call it a Bitcoin charade. I mean, there's nothing to back anything of what they say, but
military takeover is not exactly what happened there either.
No.
About a year ago, Bukele requested emergency powers to confront the crime problem. Among the requested powers were arresting individuals without probable cause, restricting free assembly, and tapping phones and communications. Faced with immense pressure, both from public outcry over violence and from Bukele himself, Congress granted him emergency powers in a state of exception. The state of emergency has since been renewed 11 times, and Bukele retains his power.
So people need to understand the history in El Salvador. I mean, it literally had the highest murder rate in the world. Like, you were more likely to die in El Salvador than many war zones throughout the world. And this went on for decades. And it was starting to improve after Bukele took over. Even before he took over, in all fairness, the murder rate had come down some, but it was still, many times what if U.S. citizens would find acceptable. And there was a surge in violence. The gangs wanted to reassert their power like they have in the past. They have basically had these killing sprees or burned buses with people on them or done these different things to show the government that they are in control and to force the government to back down. And so this happened. There was, I think it was 80 people. What was the number there that were killed over I don't know if that gives numbers here, but there was this one weekend where they had, I think like 80 people were murdered just in this one weekend. And so that was when this new plan was put into place. But really the gangs purposely had that killing spree to show the government, hey, if you don't do what we want to do and play ball with us, that we're going to make it painful for you. And in the past, a lot of times the governments had given in to the gangs, where this time he decided to go the other direction and say, hey, we've tried negotiating with the gangs before. We've done these things. It's never really helped. And so he went to the other extreme. And yes, it was extreme. I mean, I don't think there's any other way you can do it. There's no half measures. I mean, basically the country was at war with themselves. And in order to win, you have to be willing to go all the way with it. And the majority of Salvadorans, 90+% of the people, are in favor of those actions. Even most people who have family members in jail, justly or unjustly, because of this, most of them still overall support this action by the government. And so I think it's important for journalists to ask why. Like, why would the people that are supposedly the victims of this, Why would they be the ones praising the government for doing this and the ones in support of that? And that's because they've lived in a war zone. They've lived in fear. They've been extorted in their businesses. They've had their kids pulled into the gangs. They've had to ship their kids to the U.S. just for fear out of their lives. They've lived in this constant state of fear. And so for them, the suspension of their constitutional rights was a price they were willing to pay to see this come to an end.
Right. Using them, Bukele, is that where we are?
Yeah.
Using them, Bukele has put more than one of every 50 Salvadorian adults behind bars, according to one estimate.
So that is exaggerating it. It's I think 1.5% of the adult population is in jail. So that's maybe one out of every, what would that be, 75 people. Not that is a good statistic either. It's still the highest incarceration rate in the world. And so I think it's something that we should be questioning. But you have to consider it in context. Like, this was a basic war zone where the gangs controlled territory with impunity. I mean, they were the ones, they had their little fiefdoms, they laid down the law. And so this is a very unique context. And it's hard to overcome that type of control unless you come in with overwhelming force. And that's what the government decided to do.
A rate equivalent of rounding up over 6 million Americans and putting them in jail without speedy trial. No reason for arrest, no Miranda rights, and no legal representation.
So there's no way to incarcerate or to capture this many suspected gang members and to do it in an orderly fashion. I mean, this is a huge number of people. And so there's definitely been lots of mistakes. People were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But for the most part, the government had lists. They had reports from other people of who was involved in the gangs, controlled things in different areas. And they went after these specific people. Now, the courts are definitely bogged down, and it's taking a long time for people to go to trial. There's been a number of mass trials where people that are suspected to be in the same gang from certain areas are all tried together, which is definitely not ideal. So there's trade-offs. There's definitely innocent people that are in jail. But there's also, this is a very hard thing for the country to come to terms with, because the gangs touched every area of life. And so there was lots of people, they might not have been officially gang members, but they were supporting the gang members. Some of them were doing that just out of fear for their lives. And so are they guilty or not guilty? It's very messy. It's very hard to discern who should be locked up, who should be free. But the other option of not having a messy confrontation of this is to let the existing system continue. And that existing system was sucking hundreds and thousands of kids into it every month, into the gangs, because it was like, hey, the gangs are a cool place to be. There's no real repercussions. They control all the different zones. People have to respect you if you're in the gang. And so there was a sense for a lot of the kids of like, yeah, why not join? Where now you're seeing nobody wants anything to do with the gangs. They don't want any family members in the gangs. They want... So it's really stopped this future pipeline and probably saved tens of thousands of young people from entering in that gang life. And so you really have to weigh these trade-offs. Like, yes, there are innocent people in there, and they should be doing everything they can to try to decipher who theirs are. But there's also tens of thousands of people who have been kept from entering the gangs, who have been kept from being murdered. And so you have to balance those things. And you can't have the one without the other. There was no clean way to do that. And so I think when journalists come in and want to make all these accusations, they should at least have the nuanced conversation of like, yeah, these were the trade-offs, or if they have a better opinion on how it should be done, bring that out. But it's very easy to go in and just criticize people and say all the things they've done wrong. But for the first time in decades, people feel safe in El Salvador. That's the reality.
It's true. And now Bukele has attempted to convince the world that the drop in crime is due to his wave of arrests. Of course, refusing to give up any of his powers, even as he takes credit for reducing crime. Evidence from a U.S. federal court indictment, however, suggests that another Bukele action, one he'd want to keep secret, might be playing a larger role. A deal he has made with MS-13 and other gangs to win re-election.
So this is just so laughable and so contradicts itself in so many different ways. I'm just embarrassed for the journalist. So there have been historically in El Salvador lots of negotiations between the gangs and the government. That's common, not just in El Salvador, but lots of different places where there's certain crime, families or elements that wield significant power. It's normal a lot of times for there to be some sense of negotiation between the government and the people that are committing the violence. In the history of El Salvador, there's been several truces by different governments. One of the more famous ones was actually helped to be brokered by the Catholic Church, where they brokered this, deal, this truce between the gangs. And during that time, it brought down the murder rate, but the extortion rate actually increased because the gang members were kind of free to go out and extort as long as they weren't actually killing people. But so I don't know the exact details and whether there was negotiations between the Bukele government with the gangs or not. Probably there have been with almost every administration. There's high likelihood that they weren't coming from the top, that these were mid-level negotiations. They were just part of normal trying to govern in different areas. But it's definitely not what brought the murder rate down. The murder rate was brought down as Bukele went to the other extreme and hardcore locked up all of these gang members. So for them to insinuate that, yes, Bukele is like really going after the gangs, locking everybody up, holding them in not the nicest conditions, but there's a truce and there's an agreement between them and the gangs, a friendly agreement, and that's why the murder rate has come down. It just makes no sense. Like, he has gone no holds barred after the gangs. There's no truce there. The drop in murder rates has nothing to do with any agreement. Now, if he wasn't arresting people and the gang members were getting white glove treatment, then you might say, yeah, maybe that's why the murder rate has gone down. But it's right. The complete opposite. So they're taking one little element and they're trying to say that is the reason that the murder rate dropped. No, the murder rate dropped because they've locked up tens of thousands of people. Right. So it's right. It's hard to even like go through and have like a rational discussion about it, because it just doesn't make any sense. Anyways, go on. In the unsealed evidence in the case of the U.S. government against MS-13 gang members, prosecutors presented evidence that Bukele made a deal with the transnational gang to refuse to extradite MS-13 members to the United States in exchange for the criminal organizations reducing the number of murders until the 2024 presidential election. In other words, the tough on crime stance of Bukele may be nothing but a power grab, with the reduced homicide rate a mirage produced by a background deal with criminals who operate in the U.S. What? It's curious to see how the videos that won Bukele praise from many online influencers on the right went viral shortly after this evidence became public. But if bore out, these allegations would prove that Bukele is no American ally and is instead actively working with the criminals to terrorize American communities to stay in power. What? So I'm just so embarrassed for the guy who wrote this. Now, there's definite possibilities that there were backroom deals with the gangs that were done. And it could have been that those 87 people that were killed over that weekend was that the government here saying like, well, obviously it's not going to work to negotiate with the gang. So we have to go to the other extreme and lock them all up. But to on one hand be like criticizing and how they're not protecting the gang members' constitutional rights and their the conditions they're being held in are not humane and all these things. So basically you're saying that he's brutalizing and terrorizing the gang members. And then he turns around saying like, no, actually really they have an agreement.
He's actively working with
they're
the criminals
working
to terrorize.
together.
Which is it, pal?
You can't have it both ways. Like, I don't know. I don't have any inside information and I don't, focus too much on the politics, but I do think there was possibility that maybe early into the terms, they told the gangs like, hey, you need to cut out the murder rates or we're going to come after you. And if you hold the murder rates down, we'll kind of, give you free reign a little bit. But it's obviously that's not what's happened in the last couple of years. The government has come hard after them, even if they have publicly made videos saying that they want to negotiate with Bukele. He's responded and come after them even harder. So it's obviously they're not in cahoots. So
I don't know. I don't know how anyone.
I don't know how an editor would allow this to come out. Like you cannot have it both ways. It's just. Anyways,
let's continue. To make matters worse, Bukele and his allies have received millions of dollars from subsidiary companies of PDVSA, the oil company of Venezuela's socialist regime. Moreover, Bukele's allies on a so-called shadow cabinet of all Venezuelan advisors.
So this is, again, he's trying to have it both ways. Like they're saying on one hand that they're, taking dirty money from Maduro and the Venezuelan, leader in power and the corrupt reign of oil companies, which historically there have been lots of rumors about some of the oil companies that are in El Salvador being fronts for the Venezuelan government and funneling money to the FMLN, which is the left-wing political party that Bukele was once part of, but was kicked out of for calling out some of its leaders. So on one hand, they're saying he's getting money from Maduro, and then they go on to talk about his shadow cabinet of all Venezuelan advisors. He does have many Venezuelan advisors, but they are from the opposition that is basically sought refuge because they were against Maduro. And so now a lot of them are serving and helping in El Salvador in different things. So same thing. He's saying like, on one hand, trying to say he's in cahoots with Maduro, but then going on to like pointing to the fact that he has Venezuelans in government to show proof of how he's in cahoots with Maduro. But these people are the ones that are against Maduro. So I don't know if this journalist doesn't understand that, if doesn't understand the different parties and the opposition that exist in Venezuela and that those are the people that are part of the Salvadoran government, or if the journalist does understand that and is just trying to confuse the public. But it's such poor journalism.
Trying to confuse the public. And here it is in the next paragraph. It says, yet Americans who seldomly follow what happens in Latin America are now commenting on it as experts, saying that America needs someone like Bukele. Now, like the leftists who wish America was like Cuba, they forget to mention that thousands of Salvadorians make their way to the U.S. every single month seeking a better life, not the other way around.
So,
okay.
Yes, El Salvador has for decades had people fleeing, but we're actually seeing that start to turn around because conditions are improving in El Salvador under Bukele. I'm not a super fan of Bukele. I like to remain a skeptic. I don't ever want to be shilling for the government or simping for the government. I think there's lots of reasons to hold ourselves out as critics and to really evaluate things. But it's embarrassing, the attacks on Bukele. They're so ill-conceived and thought out that I feel obligated to come and say, like, at least do decent journalism. Like, it's not because of Bukele that these people are leaving. Actually, he has shifted the number of people that are leaving El Salvador because they actually feel like they can build a life here for the first time. They're not afraid of dying and being murdered like they were before. But he links these two things together.
So misleading.
And on the last thing, he says that, Salvadorans make their way to the U.S., not the other way around. Actually, it is the other way around. You're seeing
exactly the other way around now.
Thousands of Salvadorans are returning to El Salvador from the U.S. They think there's better opportunities here. And not just Salvadorans. I mean, refugees from Canada, from New Zealand, from people all over the world that feel persecuted by their own governments are now coming to El Salvador. And I don't know. It's just.
It doesn't take a very deep journalistic dive to figure those particular facts out that you just laid out, Mike.
That's why it just perplexes me. I would expect this from CNN or MSNBC, but National Review, it's really caused me to like, hey, there's a lot of things I just took at face value that they wrote in the past. Maybe I need to go back and do a deeper dive on those things because apparently they just don't have journalistic integrity. And I'm hoping this is a one-off, that this isn't, something that is endemic throughout their whole platform, but it's just.
Other countries in the region, such as Colombia, with the help of the United States, have been able to go from poor, dangerous countries in the middle income and relative safe spaces to live, all without autocratic rule. So
the transformation that happened in Colombia took decades. And actually, a lot of people are saying that's been eroded more recently. And it was a very different thing that was happening there. It was basically the drug cartels that were controlling things. The gang issue is something that's very different. And so I don't think most Salvadorans were content to wait a couple decades for this to happen. And there, the people were living, it was very much more segregated. The cartels controlled certain areas where the gangs here were endemic everywhere in El Salvador. So there was really no safe place before. So it's just the comparisons. I mean, they don't make any sense.
Right. Bukele might be hailed as a cool, quote unquote, cool millennial, a tough on crime leader, or the Bitcoin president, but American conservatives shouldn't fall for him or his tactics. This is the meat of the article, I suppose. He's not really a conservative or an American ally. He's just another power-hungry Latin American strongman.
So I always invite people to be skeptics and to question the government. And I think because Bukele is so insanely popular, that's even more important, because maybe people are willing to give him a pass and not call him out on things when they should. But let's at least have the real facts in place when we do these things. I mean, this makes it so that if there were actual atrocities or illegal or unethical things that were happening, nobody's going to believe them, because you've ruined your credibility calling out things that any fourth grader can see through. So, and I picked the National Review because like I said, I think they're one of the better publications out there. The stuff coming out from CNN and MSNBC, you look at man, if we try to dissect this, we'll be here for days, because they literally can't get a single fact right. But I think it's very important for people to really understand the history of what's happened in El Salvador and how extraordinary the transformation that is happening right now really is. And if people are critics of the way that things are happening, then let's bring other solutions to the table. How do you tackle the endemic control of gangs in a country like this, where really their tentacles are in everything? How do you do that in a way that is cleaner, that it protects people's civil rights? Because it is messy. I mean, I know people that are in jail unfairly. I know other people that are in jail, and I don't think they should be in jail, but then I talk to other people and they're like, well, you don't know all the facts that are there and all the things that are there in their history. Right. And so it's messy. But if they can turn things around now and keep this cycle of destruction from happening, literally millions of lives will be improved and saved, not just now, but for generations into the future. They're really breaking these cycles. And so I think we need to be taking like a nuanced approach and look at it like everything's not exactly how we would like it to be, but it's easy to second guess when you're not the ones on the front lines trying to make these decisions. And I don't know how the police do it. I mean, the gang members that are killing people, a lot of times they look like a 12, 13-year-old harmless kid. Right. But those are the ones that are usually the trigger men that are, and it's sad, but that's the reality. But if we don't kind of cut it off, cut the knees out from under it and start fresh, it's just going to keep perpetuating itself. And so I would challenge the National Review to go back, look at all these critiques that I've brought, and then if you think I'm wrong, come back and challenge me on them. But you're so off on so many things that you have to throw the whole story out and start from scratch. So that's my take. I am going to keep doing these type of critiques on these articles because I think that's the only way for us to get the real news out. I would invite journalists to come down, put your feet on the ground. I'm guessing that this person who wrote this story didn't visit El Salvador, probably never has visited El Salvador. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they would have at least taken the time to come down and visit. But from the tone of the article and the way they get all these things wrong, I'm pretty sure they've never been to El Salvador. So we need to do better, and we need to make sure that people that we're listening to actually understand what's going on. All right, that's all for me tonight. I'm signing off here from Bitcoin Beach.